suspect. I will be the champion. Alright. Hey. Cold wet, trouble like that. Blow your mind. Do it and so without wasting time. Cold wet, cold fire. Bang with a coin that blow your mind. Cold wet, trouble like that. Blow your mind. Do it and so without wasting time. Cold wet, cold fire. Bang with a coin that blow your mind.
So, good evening, everyone. Welcome to another DIGFM meeting. My name is Steve Romig. I am the Education Content Manager at Claris. As always, it is my extreme pleasure to welcome you all to tonight's festivities. Tonight, we are honored to have Louis Parra talk about some stuff he's working on. So I don't really have any other announcements. We were talking earlier about Engage. For those of you who don't know, we're going to start the quote unquote registration process for that tomorrow. So check out our website at some point. I think it's going live at about 8 a.m. Pacific time, hopefully. So you'll get some additional information about what the Claris Engage conference is going to be all about. I can answer some basic questions about it at the end if you have any, but for the most part, I would encourage you guys to check out the website when you get a chance. I'm also going to mute everybody except for Louis, although Louis can unmute himself. But if you do have a question, although I'll leave that up to Louis whether or not he wants to take questions during or after or both. Other than that, I don't really have anything else. So I'm going to mute everybody and I'll turn it over to Louis.
Thank you very much, Steve. Can everyone see my screen okay and hear me okay? I got a yes via chat, so I'm gonna go ahead and start.
Yeah, you're good.
Awesome. So hello everyone. This is Lou De La Parra. I'm coming to you from Campbell, California. It would be my preference to meet with you all in person, but I hope that we're all remote and staying healthy and safe. As it turns out, actually, this is probably my third July DIGFM presentation on this topic. Believe it or not, actually, probably about 2 years ago, I started the original FMS API client, which is what Node-RED Contrib FileMaker is based on, and showed it off at DIGFM. So I'm very excited to be back. Seems like on a rather regular rhythm to be talking about some updates. In case you didn't get a chance to take a look at the DevCon session that I did last year, coincidentally, the last DevCon session I will have, as in the future we're moving forward with Engage. I welcome you to do so. I'm not going to be going through the flows that I created for that presentation because you can watch them online. If it's okay with everyone, I'd like to dive a little bit deeper into both the updates that I've made to Node-RED Contrib FileMaker and talk about what I see as the next steps. To Steve's point, I am going to leave it open for questions. So if you do have a question, please just unmute or ask in the chat. Eric, if you don't mind monitoring the chat for any questions, I would greatly appreciate it. If it gets to be too much and we get a little bit of sidetracked from where I want to go, I may ask us to parking lot it for the end of the session, in which case I'll save a bunch of time there. But with that, we'll kick it off. So what I have to show you today is Node-RED Contrib FileMaker. For those of you that don't know, Node-RED is a low-code programming paradigm for event-driven applications. It's also known as a flow-based paradigm. As you can see here, I have a web browser open with the Node-RED homepage. And you see that in the middle here, it says Node-RED is a browser-based flow editing tool. And what that means is that you would actually do all of your editing for Node-RED to build these flows within the browser. And that browser looks like this. And the interesting thing here is that to build a flow, to start a flow and actually run through each of the individual pieces, you would link them together similar to this. This particular flow here starts on the left-hand side with what we call an inject node or triggering node, and then passes through each individual rectangle to finally get to the end where we have a debug. In this particular flow, we're injecting some information. We're going to list some FileMaker records. We're going to extract some containers, and then show the result. And real quickly, just to show how this works, I will trigger this flow. Oh, and I actually have an incorrect token, so we'll come back to that in a second. Let me switch to the right example. There we go. And on the right-hand side here, I'll zoom in. Oh, too much. We have a payload, right? We have what would be the debug. So this is a rather lengthy way to say flow starts on the left-hand side with an inject or a triggering mechanism, and then ends on the right-hand side with the last node in the flow. Now, this particular paradigm allows developers to shift their perspective from, say, writing scripts in FileMaker, which we all know and love, and more towards the individual events for what they're trying to accomplish. If we switch to something like a status node or an SMS activation, we might want to start with hitting the Twilio API, maybe create a record in FileMaker to send an SMS request, and then finally trigger that request off. Each one of those things are a very specific event, which allows us to chain them together and create a flow. Any questions on that so far? Awesome. That's a general overview of Node-RED and the flow-based system. Now, Node-RED Contrib FileMaker takes advantage of this flow-based paradigm in order to offer you methods, or in this case, nodes, that allow you to connect with FileMaker server via the FileMaker Data API. What you see here now is actually the open source project that Node-RED Contrib FileMaker is based on. Again, this project was actually started, I'd say about 2 years ago, and DIGFM was the first place that I showed it. And the idea behind this project is to show each individual piece of the data API via a node. So just going through this list really quick, we have the login node, which allows us to get a FileMaker token. We have the logout node, which allows us to remove a session. We have a product info node, which allows us to see what version of FileMaker we're running. We have databases. We have scripts, layouts, the create node, which allows us to create records, the edit record node, which allows us to edit records, the delete node, the get node, right, which allows us to remove records and then get record info, duplicate, list, find a node, trigger a script, and then finally upload container data and grab globals. Now, this is nothing new. We've actually seen this during my presentation at DevCon. Some of the updates that we get to see today is more related to the status information. And we'll get into what that status information looks like in just a little bit. To show you how this works, I'm going to switch to a website. And this particular website contains a list of individual, in my case, heroes that I want to make sure I celebrate with everyone. And this particular website is based on a FileMaker database. This FileMaker database you can see here. This is the individual list. If you see, we have Ada Lovelace at the top, Grace Hopper second, Edith Clark third, and that corresponds to the records we have here. If I were to select one of these records, like say Edith Clark, it's going to load a record detail view and then give me the option of uploading a file. And I'm actually going to go back. I'm going to head back to Grace Hopper, and I just want to show you how this works. I'm going to grab a file. In this case, I'm going to grab an image of Grace Hopper. I'm going to drag it into the web page, and you see it gets uploaded. That uploaded information actually gets sent to FileMaker. So there's that image. What's even cooler than that is I can actually grab a few of these. So I'm just going to duplicate this image, so we have two, and I can upload them all at the same time. Now all three have been updated. And if I take a look at my FileMaker database, I now have three of the identical images. All of this workflow is actually done via Node-RED. My Node-RED FileMaker server is FileMakerThings.com, and in this case, I want to see the admin console, so I'll go to /admin. Okay. This corresponding flow is called the hero website flow. You can see it here. And if we break down the individual pieces of the flow, we can correspond them to the website that I showed you. The first would be loading the list site, and that's FileMakerOfThings.com/heroes. Okay, that loads this list. If we take a look at the first flow in this, you'll see that, well, the first thing we do, the trigger, if you remember when we started, is receive a list request. And this is a get method on the URL of heroes. From there, we inject layout context, and this is the layout context of people API. And then we're going to use the list heroes node in order to get information from FileMaker. And in fact, I'm going to put this side by side so you can actually see this happen in real time. Close this. And reload this page once I get it all in place. And I'd like everyone to take a look at the list heroes node and the transform response node. As I load this page, you should see those nodes actually light up with a particular color. Well, actually, it was too fast to even show. Let's see if I can show that again. Oh, nope. It's not actually updated. Okay, I'll show it in a different way. What this is doing is that when I load this page, actually triggering the first flow, which is that top list, setting the context, grabbing a list of records, transforming the response into what my web page expects, and then constructing the web page via HTML. From there, I send that response back to the web browser, and that's how we get the list. Very similarly, the next row handles the detail. In this particular case, I've got a get request to /hero/ID, and that request actually creates the layout context, creates a query for my ID because I don't necessarily know what my record ID is going to be by the time I trigger the web page, finds the hero using a perform find, and then transforms the information and then uploads to a website. Very similar to what we saw before. So what we're seeing here is the mechanism of creating a website broken down into a flow paradigm and then using the Node-RED nodes to grab information from FileMaker and then display them in a browser. Any questions so far? No? Okay, everybody's kind of seen this, right? So a lot of this I touched upon it at DevCon, but at that time I didn't actually have these green buttons down at the bottom. And those green buttons that you see actually came from feedback that I found from people. And to do this, I'm going to switch to a local version of Node-RED, and we're going to intentionally break a few things and see how the system can recover and show us when there's a particular error. So I'm going to switch to a local version of Node-RED that I have. You can see that now I'm at localhost /1880, which is the local version of Node-RED that I'm running. And the flow that you see here is very similar to the original two that I showed you, right? We're triggering with an event, very similar to the first event that I showed. It's with a button. So this isn't a web page. This is just triggered via a button here. And it's going to run 3 individual nodes. It's going to run the long-running script node, the list record node, and the create record node, right? The reason why this is actually important for me to show you is that if you were to do this with a normal data API client, you'd want to make sure that you're blocking for this long-running script, right? One of the things we want to make sure that we don't do when we're running a data API request is to make 2 requests at the same time, or in this case, a list or create record request when the long-running script request is running. So I'm going to kind of show you this here. I'll deploy this first so it's ready to go. I'm going to trigger the event here. And you'll notice that all at one time, we have the list records completed, the create records completed, and the long running scripts completed, but they don't all complete at the same time. I'm going to trigger that one more time because it was a little hard to see. Notice as I trigger it, all 3 become processing with 1 showing ready. This shows the concurrency that you're able to get with Node-RED Contrib FileMaker and FMS API client. The client itself will automatically detect how many sessions you have open and then queue additional requests or create a new session depending on what I've configured. In my case here, I've set my concurrency to 5. And what that means is that my client will automatically create up to 5 concurrent sessions depending on the load request coming in. So if I only have one request that I'm looking to make, I can, like say if I were to remove this, we'll run with just one client, right? Because the only thing we're doing is triggering one script. But the second I try to do 2 at one time, the client needs to set up a second session in order to make sure that we don't have any conflicts. So this happens automatically, and it's one of the new features that I built into a Node-RED Contrib FileMaker, alongside these actual status nodes. To showcase these status nodes a little bit more, I'm going to intentionally break this node. I'm gonna make the layout a layout that doesn't exist. Does not exist. And so previously, in the previous version of Node-RED Contrib FileMaker, you would get an error, but you'd get that error via a log result, right? You'd get that error at the end here with this green node. And that wasn't always like straightforward to people. People weren't necessarily understanding where to look for a particular error or what the error might be, because it's kind of broken from the context of the node itself. So what I did was rework the UI to make it so that you now have this status node above each individual node. When I trigger this time, you'll see that I have my list record node, which is ready. It processed its information and then continued on. The long running script processed information that took a little bit longer, right, intentionally. But the create record node actually shows that the layout is missing. This is immediate feedback to the user to tell them what might be going wrong at any given time. If I were to switch this back to the people API and then click done, deploy, you'll see that automatically all 3 statuses are set up to be ready to go. And I can trigger the flow, and now we're back to normal. So one of the first big updates we have with Node-RED Contrib FileMaker is the ability to view a client status in real time via the UI. Additionally, I've added a few nodes that help with this status. So one of those is called the status node. This particular node, and I'll real quick just create a new event and tie it to a debugger. Clear my view. This particular node will let me know how much data my API client has used so far. So overall, for my Node-RED server locally, I've sent in 666 bytes and received 3.9 megabytes. I have a queue of 0, meaning all my requests were handled correctly. I don't have any pending, we're not waiting on any, and I have 5 sessions which are live, right? Of those sessions, I can see the ID for the session, when the token was issued, when the token was expired, and if I need to, I can go through and actually clear this particular client. So one of the other things that I've added to Node-RED Contrib FileMaker is the ability to view the status of each individual client. Any questions so far? Okay, let's dive a little bit deeper. So when I demoed this at DevCon, one of the things which was a significant issue that people ran into, particularly when doing this at scale, was running the Node-RED system within memory. So by default, Node-RED Contrib FileMaker uses FMS API client as its engine. Let's real quickly look at that. Now, by default, FMS API client is designed to store information in memory. right? And the reason for that is when this was originally designed, it was designed to live alongside your FileMaker server. You could proxy request to FMS API client. The session that the data API requires that contains the token needed to be kept somewhere. So I opted to keep it in memory, right? So I didn't have to worry about connecting to a MySQL database or saving it within FileMaker or even going to MongoDB. And that was great for the non-scalable integrations that I needed to do. But as I wanted to start scaling out the data API, I found that I needed to store these clients in somewhere other than memory. So to do that, I created Marpat, which is a data store that connects to AnyDB, MongoDB, and Firebase. What this allows you to do is save your Node-RED contrib FileMaker client or your FMS API client in a persistent storage layer. This storage layer is configured via, let me get there, the Marpat setting inside of Node-RED. So, and I know not everyone is familiar with this, and we can dive deeper within this session. It's not an issue. But Node-RED in and of itself contains a configuration. And that configuration looks something like this. Right? It's basically a JSON object with settings for your Node-RED server. In my particular case, I'm inserting the setting of Marpat with the URL that's a process environment variable. This process variable corresponds to a variable that I have here. And if you notice here, I don't have in memory like we saw earlier. I have MongoDB plus server, meaning it's a MongoDB server record for a local version of Mongo. I'm actually going to update this to be my local version. And make sure my compass is running. Okay, I've got my MongoDB database up and running. I would over here and restart my Node-RED process. And now we have the client saved via Node-RED. So another thing that we've added in Node-RED contrib 2.3 is the ability to save a client in a persistent storage mechanism. That storage mechanism can be MongoDB, it can be on the filing system, or it can be Firebase admin, so a Firebase data store. What this allows you to do is persist your clients over the long term and maintain the number of sessions that you have on your FileMaker server while also scaling. If you know that your FileMaker server can handle 20 requests, 20 sessions at a time, you can create those 20 sessions, save them to a data store, and then refresh them as required in order to keep your communication up and running and going. Any questions there? And actually, Eric just posted that there's additional links within the chat. So thank you very much for that. There's a lot of information I'm going to cover today, so please refer to the links. Okay, so moving along, we saw so far that we have the ability to update our status in real time. We saw that we have the ability to see a client status via an API request. And we saw the ability to configure a persistent storage for our Node-RED client. But let's dive in a little bit deeper into how we would configure these things and what it actually looks like. We're going to do that by building. Okay. Let this load. So this particular flow will extract containers automatically from a FileMaker server. And real quickly, I'm going to show you what this looks like. A table that has a few and I want to, from Node-RED, I want to connect to that FileMaker server. I want to grab the images and I want to extract them. The reason why I want to extract them is I actually want to put them somewhere. So in this case, I've got an inject node, right, which triggers our flow. I've got a list record node, response. And then I have a node that allows us to extract containers. I'm going to turn off this debug node so that first we see the response for the list record node, and then we'll see the response for the extract container node. So if you're kind of following along, we're going to inject, we're going to trigger this event, we're going to list the records, and then we're going to see the result. Make sure that as well. Okay, so you saw there was just a moment of processing. On the left or the right-hand side here, I have my payload, which is layout of people, limit of 1, container, which is the container of the image, and then the actual list information with my database, layout, table, total record count, valid count, the return count, which is 1 because our limit was 1, and then so what this does is takes an input from my inject, grabs the list information from the data API, and then outputs it to my payload. If I connect this to the extract container node, the output from my list record node will become the input for my extract container node. So if we move one more step down and show this debug, let that clear for a second so you can see it in real time. Run the inject again, and I've got a configuration error. Container, file name, list. It's actually files file. Okay, so this list record needs to be files file. Okay. Same thing. Okay, let's debug this a little bit more. Let's step through it. So we list the records. From the list records, the extract container record is looking for the payload.container and the payload.file name, which if we go back to this payload here, is field data.file and field data.file name. If we run the extract container node again, we see that my list has data, array of field data dot files file, and let's see, container file name. Actually, we might skip this one. Okay, let's try that one more time. Okay, same thing. We're going to skip over this flow because apparently my configuration is wrong. Let's create a new flow. In this particular case, I'm going to do something simple like create a record. Got my create node, got my debug node, and I'll grab my inject node. And so what this is going to do is allow me to create a record in FileMaker. I'll choose my client, which is the example client. My layout is going to be hard-coded for people API. And my payload, I will just make an empty object. And I believe I saw a question come through. I can probably multitask and do two things at once. Okay. So configuring this create node, just to keep it simple, I've set the string of people API as my layout. My data is message.payload.data. And so I'm going to trigger this flow with message.payload.data. No, that's the wrong client. Sorry. Oh, and there we go. I've got a new record created, which is record ID 107. So a little rocky, but we triggered the flow with an inject of data of nothing. We created a record. We saw the payload. If we expand this again, let's say I want to actually get the details for that particular record. I can grab the get node, add it to my flow, and tell it that I want to, again, connect to my DevCon client here, because that's the one client I'm using. I can tell it to go to that same layout, only this time, take the record ID from the payload that I received. So remember, the payload that create record had was message.payload data record ID. So message.payload data.record ID. Same thing. I apologize, folks. I had to switch computers just before the demo, so I didn't have a chance to set everything up. Record ID. Let's make sure I'm doing that correctly. Okay. My output is message.payload data. Okay, that's where I'm going. I apologize. So what I was doing was setting message.payload data record ID, but in the response, it's actually just payload.record ID. So I had it right the whole time. Choose done here. This node. And now I've created the record, got the record, and if we look at the result, I have the data, which is field data and portal data, and then I have the new record ID. So in this case, I created a record and then got that record and finally ended with the payload. So we can actually extrapolate that out and say maybe create an API out of this by using the HTTP nodes. So I'm going to use the HTTP in node, much like we saw earlier with the website, and I'll configure this to be a GET request at test. And I'm going to do an HTTP response node that returns back some information, and I'll set this to be a status code of 200. So what this effectively does is change my trigger from a button that I would click to actually be a website that I visit, much like the website we saw in the very beginning. My response is going to be the response to the website. So if I run this, and I go to localhost 1880/test, we get JSON. So the idea behind that is that to change your flow, all you have to do is swap out the individual pieces and then link them together. Each individual piece within the flow takes the input of the piece before it, the node before it, and then passes on its information to the node after it. Any questions on that? Awesome. Let's dive a little bit deeper and take a look at what that looks like under the hood. So in this case, we're going to do the same create node. This is the same node that you saw, just instead of being graphical, this is actually within JavaScript. And in this case, the client create is here. The way that this works is this node takes an input, which is the message. It calls the client create method of FMS API client, and then sends a response to the next node in the chain. Each individual node is chained together to create a flow. Now, the reason why this is so cool is that a flow is actually just constructed of JSON. So if we head back to the main project here, you'll see that I have quite a few examples under flows, and all of these examples you can download, and I'll show you how to do that in a moment. And actually see the create example that I just showed you is just JSON. In fact, I can take this entire thing, copy it to my clipboard, head back to my local version of Node-RED, and import it just by pasting it. And so now here's my create example flow. And in fact, I've created examples for every single node within the project. So one thing to note though, when you export or import via JSON, we don't save your client. And that's for security, right? We don't want you accidentally giving your data API credentials to anyone that you don't need to, right? Or you don't expect to. So each time you create an example flow, if you've already got the client, it's going to fill it in for you. But let's say you don't, right? I'm actually going to go in here and I'm going to delete this client. You'll be presented with the add new data API client, much like this. If you needed to create your own, you click the edit button here, and that's going to pop up the client configuration properties. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the client is based on the data API, right? So it creates sessions. And so in this case, let's see if I have it loaded. I don't. Okay. I'll skip to one that I already have loaded, just so you can see this. In this case, my server is here. The database that I'm connecting to is here. I've got a no timeout specified, and what that means is that if there is a longer running request, the Node-RED is going to wait for that request to finish before it carries on, right? If for whatever reason you wanted to ensure that, say, your scripts didn't run more than 150 milliseconds, or that's not 150, that's 150. You could set that timeout, and Node-RED Contrib FileMaker will throw an error, which you could decide to catch if you'd like. But by default, there's no timeout. So by default, the Node-RED Contrib FileMaker is going to wait for as long as you need it to complete a request. Below that, as we saw earlier, is the concurrency. This is how many sessions a particular Node-RED flow will create in order to support traffic. By default, the concurrency is 1, meaning that if you have 2 or 3 requests at one time, it's going to queue those requests up and play them sequentially. Right? You could put this to whatever you like. When I tend to create flows, I do about between 25 and 50, depending on the FileMaker server that I have. Node-RED Contrib FileMaker is smart enough not to create a client if it doesn't need it. So if you create a client that has a concurrency of 25, but you don't use it sparingly, you may only see 1 or 2 clients created at a time. Lastly, to configure a client, you have account and password. The one thing to note here is that the account and password has to match the privilege set that has FM REST enabled inside of FileMaker, right? Because again, this is using the data API in order to trigger functions. The last thing that I left to the end is another new feature. Again, one of the feedback that I heard after the last DevCon is that a lot of times, either when developing or in an environment where you don't have an SSL ready, we want the ability to turn it off. So that is what I've built in. The latest version of Node-RED Contrib FileMaker actually allows you to specify whether or not you want to require SSL. Now there's both a word of warning here and a note. The warning is that SSLs are good, right? We want to try to keep the traffic encrypted whenever possible. So I would highly recommend only doing this when you're in a development environment and actually having a valid SSL any other time. The other thing to note is that require SSL turns off the ability to reject or the ability for the agent to reject any incoming information. You still need to specify HTTPS for the server, and that's a FileMaker requirement, right? So if you were doing this to a server that did not have an SSL, right, you would uncheck the require SSL button, but keep the HTTPS within the server. And what this effectively means is I'm going to try to connect via HTTPS, but if it fails, I'm not going to reject with an error. I'm going to allow it to continue. Any questions on setting up a client? Okay.
We are getting a few additional questions in the chat that are building up. Maybe we want to.
Sure. Let's do this.
Slightly off topic, but
let's talk about a few advanced flows now that I've gone through some of the basics. We'll do some deploy stuff as well, because I know that that's something people want to talk about, and then we'll open it up for questions. Is that okay with everybody? I'm going to take silence as a yes. So.
sounds good.
Okay. Let's switch back to my FileMaker Things server, where all the good stuff happens, and talk about some more advanced flows and how this could be used in a real-world environment, and then we'll circle back for questions and deployment. So again, this is a server that I'm running via AWS, and we can certainly look at it towards the end of the meeting. I'll show you how it's deployed. And some of the more advanced things that I want to show you is something like listing IoT devices. If we head back to my FileMaker file here, you'll see that I have quite a few particle devices listed on the left-hand side. And what you see here is details for each of the individual devices. Now, one great thing about Node-RED and FileMaker working together is you can use Node-RED to trigger flows in external APIs without having to actually script them within FileMaker. To show this off here, I've got a sync devices button down here. This sync devices button is going to trigger a script, and we'll see what that script looks like in a second, which is going to send an API request to this flow here. And this flow is going to receive the API request, save it so that I can respond to it later, call the particle cloud function of list devices, figure out which devices I don't have in my FileMaker file automatically, query for each of them, find those devices, and then optionally either edit the record because I already have it, or create the record because it doesn't exist, join all the responses together, and then send the response back to FileMaker. On the FileMaker side, if we were to take a look at that script, it looks like this. I set my script parameter, which is normal. I tend to do that all the time. I grab any required parameters out of the script parameter. I toggle perform script on server because I tend to like most of my scripts performed on server if I can. Okay, I use the HV request script from Geist Interactive, and kudos to Geist Interactive for creating generator. That is what I use for actually creating HTTP or HTTPS calls. And then based on the response that I get back, I send it back to my UI or exit the script with an error. So the script itself is actually fairly straightforward and fairly basic. The flow itself has a little bit more logic to it, but it's not crazy. Combine them together and you get an automatically updating device list with little to no overhead on your FileMaker file. Okay, and we can see here in this case, because this is a little bit longer running, the flow has fired. It's currently processing the edit device record. In this particular case, I don't have any new devices, so none of the information is going to update, but we can see that flow kind of working through Node-RED here. Very similarly, and this is something that I think works really well with add-ons, we have the ability to use Node-RED to graph API requests or graph IoT data using Node-RED itself. So what you're seeing here is a graph request that constructs a query, performs a find with FileMaker, transforms a response, extracts the percentage from the response, maps it to a particular range, builds a graph for that response, and then sends that graph back to FileMaker. Now, in this case, I actually need to restart my server because it's being a little finicky. So let me do that, and then we'll run that one more time. Okay, let's see if that.
What makes the server finicky?
The fact that I switched computers just before the presentation. This particular file was not configured to talk to this server. So that's why a lot of the demos that you're seeing here are getting stuck in different places. So if you'd like, we can actually switch to deployment. Does that sound good to everyone, or do we want to go with questions now? Let's see, let's bring up the chat.
Let's go ahead and handle some questions. We may miss some if they
Sure.
keep escalating.
So the first one from Jay is, how would you compare this with Claris Connect? I think they're inherently different. This, as you can probably tell, given the presentation, is much more low level. It requires that you build your flow from a developer standpoint, from an engineering standpoint, whereas Claris Connect is really designed to build a similar flow, but in a much more user-friendly way. This tends to be more engineering friendly. From Eric, why did the server connect fail at first? And I think what you're seeing is, let's see, I'll deploy this. Oh, I'm sorry. I'll do that one more time so you can actually see it fail. Maybe it was my local that was doing it. See if I can actually get it to fail. It's been failing the whole presentation. Now it's not gonna. That. So what you're seeing there for that failure is actually the client isn't ready. Let me do that one more time so I can show you what this looks like. And that ties back to the very first point that I made when we started the presentation, when we're talking about this real-time feedback. It takes a second for the client to connect to FileMaker and negotiate the credentials, whether that's creating a new session or whether that's making sure that a particular session already exists and that it's okay to use it. So when you're seeing that error occur, and I'll try to do that one more time, what it is that I'm actually clicking the button too fast for the server to be ready. As you see there, I clicked it like 5 or 6 times, and the very last time it says that it's ready. It's hard to catch, but if you're kind of eagle-eyed, you'll notice that there's a blue loading screen or blue loading option down at the bottom, and that tells us that our client is not necessarily ready. The error that you're seeing, which is only on my local here, is me clicking the button too fast. So Node-RED is saying like, hey, the client's not ready yet, give us a second, and then we'll process it. Interestingly enough, though, if you do that often enough, the request will queue up. And that's, again, one of the big parts of Node-RED FileMaker and FMS API client is that if you make multiple requests at one time, it will queue those requests so as not to overwhelm your FileMaker server. Is there a test server where we can try things out? That's from John Rosen. So that I know of, you know what, actually, no, it's not true. I think there is a free version of Node-RED that you can try, because again, Node-RED is open source and Node-RED Contrib API client is open source as well. There is a service out there. Let me see if I can find it real quick. Fred, yes, front end for Node-RED. So Fred is a service that's offered. They have a paid and a free version. I've actually used the free version. If you wanted to just test this out, I'd recommend giving that a try, right? In my particular case, for FileMaker of things, the server that I have up, that is a very, very small, I think it's a T2 small, if I remember correctly, server that I've had running for like the last 1.5 years, just kind of doing individual things whether that's supporting any demos or actually maintaining uptime. So it's relatively inexpensive. You can get these servers fairly cheap. And if you wanted to even just test something like this out, check out Fred. Here, he's a good guy. Okay, and then I think Eric asked a question about DevCon slides, and Jay asked a question about FileMaker solution design, mentioned queuing, for example, which related to capacity scaling. Okay, let's see. So first thing I'll kind of show off is some of the background documentation. These are my slides from the DevCon presentation. You saw some of them today, but I'd also highlight their individual websites on pretty much every slide, linking to a lot of the information that I provided. So if you're looking for more info than what you get here, what you got in the DevCon presentation or what the presentation that I did last year, take a look at the slides which Eric put in the chat. Each slide contains links to the individual repositories. I think this is actually one of the best repositories out there. It's the Node-RED tutorial, which starts off from how to actually get Node-RED running, access it in a browser, create your first inject node, which is the first thing we did in this presentation, add a debug node, wire them together, and then deploy. The other thing that I will mention, and you can get this online if you go to the FileMaker community, the FileMaker file that I showed you today is available for free. Anyone can download it and use it, and it's actually got a link to run Node-RED locally. So there's that piece as well. In fact, one of the best ways that I found to run Node-RED is locally in a cluster. And I've been, over the last 6 months or so, actually building it within a cluster of Raspberry Pis. The way that this works is I use a service called Kubernetes, if anybody's ever heard of that, to run Node-RED on 5 Raspberry Pis, and then as required, depending on the scalability needs, it'll actually spin up to use either one of the Node-RED Pis or one of the Pis or 5 of them. So just to piggyback on that a little bit, if you really wanted to just get started in the most low level possible, head on over to my GitHub repository. Which is Node-RED Contrib FileMaker. And then once you clone this repository, you can get Node-RED up and running by simply running npm install, which will install all the dependencies for you. And then finally, npm run dev. And that's going to automatically, in this case, it was already up and running. That's going to automatically start up a local Node-RED version for you. So really with 2 web clicks to get to this web page, and then pull down the repo and 2 CLI commands, you can be up and running with Node-RED. Okay, Jay's question was around scalability. So let's take a quick second and talk about that. I'm going to actually talk about the scalability in terms of the scaling that we saw here, and we'll run through that one more time, just so everybody can see it. Let's make sure I'm actually running here. Yeah, okay. In this particular case, this is a pretty good analogy for what you need to become scalable. And the biggest thing that I've found in my use of this is to make sure that your concurrency is actually where it needs to be. In this particular case, it's 5. If I were running this in production, again, as I mentioned earlier, it'd probably be 25 or 50. And the reason for that is because I want to make sure that these long-running scripts don't block any of the other requests that I have come in, right? we have execute script script step, which is amazing data API endpoint, but it is one of the only endpoints that we really can't control the response for, right? When you execute a script via the data API, you are really at the mercy of whoever wrote that script to return a result or exit before you're going to get a response. And in the web world, that could be a really long time, right? Even 2 or 3 seconds in the web world could be long enough to make an API timeout. So what you really want to make sure you do when you're building these sort of things is allow for enough concurrency so that while those long-running scripts are happening, you don't block any other requests. The other thing I'll mention, which I believe I mentioned in my DevCon presentation, is building APIs that are, building layouts that are specific to your individual needs. So for me, and this is just my own way of doing it, I create specific layouts for my APIs. I have an event API, a device API, a log API, file classes, classifier people, API layouts that are specifically geared with only the information that I need. And the reason why is the data API is layout based. The more fields you have in the layout, the more information you're going to have to return to the client. So I try to build my FileMaker solutions around the data API layouts that I need with only the fields that I need and really no other items. So that's a big scalability thing that I see often is rather than just targeting maybe your UI layouts, something like this here that has a container field, which we may not need, a biography field, a name field, maybe some pop-up information that may be part of like metadata layout. Build them specifically for what you're doing. So 2 biggest things I've seen: plan for scalability, meaning have many sessions queued up, and then when you scale with layouts that are as simple as possible. Then I guess the next one is also from James. On the IoT side of things, what cool and crazy ideas for applying this do you wish you could build? That's a really good question. In my time so far, I've really spent a lot of time with particle devices. I found that they are really, really cool. They're really, really good. So from an IoT perspective, I'm actually quite happy with their devices. They used to have, or I guess they still have, but it's not necessarily as popular. They used to have mesh-based devices, which are the argon and the boron. So I'd like to continue to work with that. And then as I mentioned, and I'll actually maybe show my camera in case you folks can't see, the clustering of processes via Raspberry Pi. I'll actually show you what that looks like. Can you folks see me now? Just kind of curious. I just turned on my camera. Maybe I'll do this. Let's see. Let's grab photo booth, right? Photo booth is allows you to see things. Cool. Hey, everyone can see me, right? Okay. So I mentioned that I like to run these via Raspberry Pis. And so what you see here is actually, let me unplug it. What you see here is actually the cluster of Node-RED Raspberry Pis that I have. Of course, right now it's off. So this is one of the coolest things that I enjoy building. These are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, actually 7 Raspberry Pis, all clustered together, running Node-RED, all within a little capsule. So from an IoT perspective, that's what I've been working on. That's really the crazy cool thing that I wish I could build that I actually ended up building. Cool. Let's see. I believe I have an hour, Eric. Do I have more than that, or do we have a hard stop at 6:30? I'm open to keep you on
if 7:30. Yeah, but 7:30 actually.
Oh, awesome. Cool. So I guess I'll open it up for more questions, and if not, we can look at a few other integrations with Node-RED.
What I didn't see you do much coding here. Like, how much JavaScript do we have to learn to be able to use Node-RED effectively?
For Node-RED, none. You don't have to learn any JavaScript at all. right? It is all UI based. And actually, let's dig into that a little bit more. Let's switch to a more advanced flow. I'll go back to my FileMaker of Things web UI. Oh, sorry. Go back to my admin. Let's look at something that might be a little bit more logically heavy, meaning like a lot of if-then statements, and take a look at what that looks like. So, and I think actually the Watson image classifier is a good example of that. Let me reload this real quick. So this is one of the presentations one of the demos that I did at DevCon. This is an image classification system that uses Watson, which is a machine learning environment by IBM. What this actually does is allow you to give it a bunch of images, classify those images, and then send back the results to FileMaker. Much like we saw earlier, this flow starts out with an API request. It sets the layout, context, and find query. Let's take a quick second to look at that. Which, in terms of JavaScript, that might look something like. Let's see if we can find an example. I'll open up FMS API client so you can see. Here's a find request. If we were to do this in JavaScript, it would look like this, right? It would look like client.find heroes with an array and a limit, and then we'd log the result, right? Within Node-RED, it actually looks something like this. Okay, to set my parameters, I'd set a message.query, set a query ID, set a message layout, just kind of setting properties via the UI rather than, as you saw it in JavaScript, actually within an array and that sort of thing. So if I were to actually log this out, and I'll adjust this a little bit so we can see it. Okay, close that, deploy it. Put up my side panel so you can see what this looks like. And trigger this, you'll see that I get an object with a query, a layout, a container, and a payload, right? So in order to set things via Node-RED, all you have to do is fill out on the right-hand side the individual pieces you need. So that is, I think, much more straightforward than setting properties on an object within JavaScript. But even further than that, what about things like logical gating, things like splitting results from an array or an if-then-else logic? You can see those here. This is what's called a split node. What this split node does is say, like, anytime I have an array, split that array into individual messages, and then join, which is, no, join's not actually on here. I'll add join so you can see it. And then join, which would put the information back together. So everything is represented via UI. And in fact, I can do things like a switch statement to set individual items or go down an individual path just by saying, like, either the classes is empty or do this. And what that allows us to do is either take the top path or the bottom path, right? If my classes are empty, I'm going to filter with string payloads and create the record. If my class is not empty, I'm going to find the IDs and then update the record. So even things like logical updates can be done via the UI. If I wanted to add even like a third option here, let's say I wanted to like throw an error if there's no class that exists, I can click the add button down at the bottom and say, just throwing out something, if the number is equal to 1, go this path. And now I have 3 nodes to split off of, and I can add something just to show you what this looks like directly to that node. And what that's going to allow me to do is, if the first condition is met, if it's empty, it's going to go to the top. If the second condition is met, or in this case otherwise, which probably is a good example here, it's going to go down to the bottom. And then if the third condition is met, it's going to go to the very last one. Does that help answer your question, Eric?
Yes.
Awesome. So Larry asked, is there any need for looping in this flow method? There is actually, and this is probably a good example of that. If you notice, I have this split classes here, and that's kind of a good example of a loop because it actually, when Watson gives me back the result, it's going to give me back an array of results, right? Instead of looping through it, what I'll do is split each individual item into pieces in the flow and then deal with each of those items one by one. So less than looping, you're more splitting, but in effect, it becomes the same thing, which is where you're dealing with each item individually within the flow. You're not triggering the flow each time, you're just splitting out each option within the flow, but that's very similar. You could also, if we kind of expand here, I'll show you another one. You can also do a kind of loop with something like this. This is, and I didn't show this off because this is actually outside of FileMaker. This is an Uptime Monitor. And what this allows us to do is every minute test a particular server to make sure that it's up. And if it isn't up, it's going to send a request to Jira to create a ticket to basically show that there's been a service degradation and that someone should go and take a look at it. The other thing that it'll do is send a notification, in this case to Pushover, which is a push API service that I use, to let me know that that server's down. So in this particular case, I'm not necessarily doing a loop, but I am starting a race condition and then closing that race condition if it is actually up. So what that looks like here is that I'm constructing the endpoint. I'm saying, okay, go to this endpoint, and then if you actually receive information, close it. And I do that with what's called a trigger loop, which is here, and a delay loop. What this looks like is the endpoint gets triggered. I trigger this delay loop, which does nothing at first, and then after 1 second, we'll send the original message. And then if I receive a response in the right time, I reset. So similar to a loop in that we're creating kind of an overarching condition that'll go over and over and over again. But again, rather than it restarting the flow, everything is handled within the flow context. Awesome. That is about what I have to demo for you folks today. Again, a lot of my demos suffered from my last minute switch between one computer and another, but I'm also happy to build any flows with you if anyone wants to throw out a flow that they want to see built in real time. Happy to do that.
Louis.
Yes, sir.
I heard Vince or somebody mentioned that you were working at or with FileMaker. Is that true?
That is true. I started working at a company called Claris, I'd say back in November, and that's my reason for moving up to the Bay Area, and so I've been there since then.
Oh, and what is it you do there now?
I like to think I'm really good at providing coffee to people, but I'm currently the web and QA engineer.
What is that?
I'm currently the web QA engineer.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, it's a pretty cool company. I enjoy it. Awesome. Well, thank you very, very much, folks. Go ahead.
One quick question about if you have anything in there to assist, like with OAuth or authentication.
That's an excellent question. Let's actually dive into that a little bit because I do. I mentioned actually in the DevCon demo and in the demo that I did today, a lot of hitting API endpoints. And then to your point, when you do that, you do want to have some sort of authentication. Now, one thing that I really enjoy to do is actually use Gwt Tokens, which is a JSON representation of a token. Right? We can actually see if we go to gwt.io, what one of these things look like. Right? So this is the token, and when it gets decoded, it looks something like this. And they're a really good way of securing an API endpoint. One of the techniques that I like a lot is to actually use FileMaker and Node-RED together in order to make sure that things are secure. So one of the tactics I take, and I'll try to actually build this with you here, is to create a flow which actually updates or creates a record in FileMaker with that GWT token. Let's see if I can do this on the fly. And then FileMaker would use that GWT token to call that same API. So let's see, I'm gonna actually have to try to install a GWT token node here. Let's see if I can do it. See if it'll run. I may have to restart my process. Oh, cool, it did. Okay. So now that I've installed that library, I'll go to the GWT sign and I'll add that node into my flow. And I've never actually seen this particular version before, so let me take a quick look at it. Secret will be test. No file. Let's see what that does. See if that gives me output. Oh, it says expired in is invalid. Nope. Let's grab a different library. I think I've actually used this library before, so this is even better. Should actually, it's not something I mentioned in the very beginning, but this is kind of good to mention. All the nodes that are available for Node-RED, there are a lot that are default, but there are a lot that you can get as what's called the library. It's available inside of Manage Palette and then install, including the FileMaker nodes that I wrote. So I have it already installed, but you can see it here. This is Node-RED Contrib FileMaker. Once you've got Node-RED running, you could actually install Node-RED Contrib FileMaker via just the button in the same way that I did this request just now. So let me find, there we go, JWT out. Okay, let's see what that gives me. Cool, okay. So I've got actually, in this case, it's a number, which is probably not what we're looking for. Payload. Okay, and what I would do here to secure a connection between FileMaker and Node-RED is actually on a time frame, like say inject once after 0.1 seconds, and then on an interview of say every hour, because my GWT tokens expire every hour, I'm going to create a record in FileMaker. Let me connect that together. I think I have that layout correctly. And that's actually going to create the GWT token. Correspondingly, when I go into FileMaker, and we'll look at that script that I wrote earlier, when I'm sending that information back to FileMaker, back to Node-RED, I would actually just include that token in the request, much like you would any other request. So if you see here, I'm setting my request. One of these options here would be headers.auth, right? Let's see if I can copy that real quick. And it's a string because it's a JSON token. So that would allow me to send this particular request with authentication. On the other side, when I'm actually building the HTTP endpoint, I'm going to include the other portion of the JWT signature. So I'll grab my HTTP response node, much like we saw earlier. And the next node in the case will be the JWT in, right? Because I want to verify. and then maybe perform an action. Maybe I want to create a record or list an API and that sort of a thing. So what this will allow me to do is automatically update the Gwt token in FileMaker every hour as it expires. FileMaker then uses that token when it talks to the HTTP endpoint to verify that that endpoint is that the user, the client, in this case FileMaker, is allowed to access that endpoint. Does that answer your question? A kind of a long-winded way of answering your question. Use a Gwt token that you inject into FileMaker. Use that token then to authenticate into the HTTP endpoint. Awesome.
And
Cool,
are
folks.
you
Oh, go ahead.
are you presenting at Engage?
I believe
Really?
it's to be announced, right? I don't believe they've announced who's speaking at an Engage yet. Is that right? Yeah, I don't think that's been announced.
Steve?
That is correct. Sorry, it took me a while to get off of mute, but that is correct. We haven't announced anything yet.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I
It's
think
top secret, whether or not you're.
well, I don't know about it being top secret, but I know that they haven't announced it yet.
Okay. I guess Jay's asking if we're having a DIGFM meeting next month. I guess if we do have one next month, it would probably be a roundup. I guess the nice thing about having a roundup so close would be, it's all fresh in our minds still about what happened at Engage, and we don't have to wait a whole month. But we'll have to look for somebody to lead that meeting if we have that.
Sure. If Steve can't do it, I'm happy to do it in his stead. Again, I don't know if I can compare to Steve, but I can certainly try.
Well, you could see how
Usually
much
we
I
have somebody-
contribute. You could see how much I contributed to tonight's meeting. So I set the bar pretty high.
That's true. All right, folks, I'm happy to end it here unless you have any questions or anything you'd like to see. It's been my pleasure to discuss the new things that I've added to Node-RED Control FileMaker in the future. And I think just as a way to end it, I throw out that this is open source. Please, if you want to use it, it's free. If you want to add to it, if you find a bug and you want to fix it, I'd be grateful for it. This project, FMS API client and Marpad, are hopefully something that I could contribute to the community because you folks have given me a lot. So if you'd like to use this, you have questions, please come find me, ask your questions. If you want to add to it, I'd be grateful. These things are open for a reason. So,
How many people have contributed to it so far?
I think really two, right? There's one gentleman who helped me out, TM do it. I've never met him. And actually, the other contributor that you see here is Snick, and I should probably mention that. I'm real big into security. So what you'll find with any of my projects is that they're all security reviewed for each release. And then I actually keep a vulnerability list for all of them. So if you wanted to use this in a certain place, but you're not sure about the coverage or how secure it is, know that I do scan the project each release, in fact, with each commit for vulnerabilities and patch them as soon as possible. So that's one of the only other contributors.
You have any big users of it yet? Like people who are using it for production purposes?
I do. I don't know if I could actually comment on who they are, but there are quite a few people that use Node-RED. There's quite a few more that use FMS API client. I think when you start getting to like the really complex work, you'll find that there's a lot more you can do with FMS API client that you can't necessarily do with Node-RED Control FileMaker. Again, Node-RED Control FileMaker is a wrapper around FMS API client. FMS API client is really the core. That allows you to do quite a bit more.
But I guess if somebody discovered that there's something that they can't do, they could potentially build whatever it is they need to get that into Node-RED as well.
That's right. Yeah, if there's something that you need that isn't offered by the library, you are welcome to submit a pull request. and I would be happy to add it to the project because it'll benefit everybody.
Interesting. Well, thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you very much, folks. I apologize. Some of the demos didn't work as planned. I had to make a last-minute switch between computers, but it's been my pleasure to review this with you. Thank you very much. Have a good night.
Thank you.
I'm going to stop recording.